Welcome everyone to I Explore Photo Editing with Lucas. That's me. Today I want to talk about the basics of how I use Adobe Camera Raw for editing RAW files from my camera. And also I'm going to show you how I edit one of my street photos. I don't do that much editing on a street photo, so I'm going to start with that one. And in future episodes I'll do different types of photos that are a little bit more involved in editing. The reason, the motivation for this video is because I've been getting a lot of questions over the years, about from people who want to see how I make, how I edit my photos, how much I edit my photos, and I was going to make a written tutorial. Thought that's going to be a huge pain in the butt, so why not make a video? So here we are. Because this is the first video about this that I've ever made, I want to cover a few things about the basics about how I use Camera Raw, things like shortcuts and things. First, just a quick thing about how this video is going to work. You're going to see any kind of keystrokes that I make on the screen. So if I hit Control, or let's say Control Alt 1, you see that appeared on the screen right there in the bottom left corner. Okay, I'm going to try to go slow, and that way you can keep up with all the shortcuts that I'm using. Again, when people ask me about my photo editing, I don't think they really ask about the shortcuts. They want to see, how I'm doing the colors and contrast and things like that. Why am I editing them the way I am? But I think the actual functionality, the shortcuts, and all these things about Camera Raw are very important, and they really show you how quickly you can do these things if you're using the keyboard. So you're going to hear me clickety-clacking away on my keyboard. It's probably going to come up in the audio. I'll try not to do it too loud. So just enjoy the sound of that. So let's get right to it. All right, I have a photo down here in Bridge. I use Bridge for all my sorting. By the way, I don't use Lightroom. I just open them up in Bridge, let Bridge read the files, and then right-click, opening Camera Raw. That launches Photoshop usually, and then here we are. So this is the photo as you can see it straight from the camera. It's the white balance. I think this is a very old photo, by the way. I shot this one in 2012, so it's pretty long while back. You can see it's really greenish and bluish. I think at the time I was often using a incandescent white balance, even when I was just roaming around. So typically these days I just put the white balance on auto, but back then I like to be more creative with it. So that's why it's extra blue and green. And so I'm gonna kind of fix that. Generally I sort of like the look that it's going, but I'm gonna work on that. So going over quickly a couple keyboard shortcuts in Camera Raw. We have these tabs up here, right? If you can see there's the basics tab, and then like the tone curve, sharpness, etc., etc. You have to click on them, but actually there is a shortcut for this. If you hit Control Alt and a number, for example 2, as you can see, it takes you to different tabs. So I hit 3, it goes to the detail tab. If I hit 6, it's lens corrections. 8 is camera calibration. There's some things you can do with colors there, and 1 goes back there. So I use this all the time. I do not click on those things with the mouse. It's a waste of time and effort. I generally don't look at the right side of the screen here once I'm editing. I just plug in numbers, and I'm looking at the image on the left side and watching how it changes. Okay, so I'm going to go really slow in this first video, and I want to cover all the different shortcuts that I use as I use them. I'm not going to go through the whole list right now. I'm just going to talk about them as they come up. So the first one that comes up is Tab. When you hit Tab, as you can see, every time I hit it, you can see it's Tab, Tab, Tab in the bottom left. But on the right side here, you can see that cycles through the different inputs. If I hit Shift Tab, I can go back. So I can go Tab and Shift Tab. I can go back and forth. So many appeared on the screen there on the left, but you get the idea. Shift Tab goes back, and Tab goes forward. So I start with contrast. I do the white balance after I do the highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, all that stuff. There's no real reason for that, just how I do it. If you want to start with the white balance, that's fine. but I always start on this first pane, on the basics pane. So that's the first thing that opens here. So typically I'll usually, like the images that come out of most cameras, at least out of my camera, when the raw file opens up there, it's a little bit flat. So I usually give it like 30 contrast. See, I just plug in 30 there. And if I want to just go back and forth real quick to see how that setting changed, I can hit Control Z on my keyboard, and it goes back and forth. By the way, I'm a Windows user, so I'm using the Windows, keyboard shortcut. So it's Control Z. I have a Mac as well. I believe it's Command Z, but I usually do my editing on my Windows machine. So just bear with me with the shortcuts there. Anyway, plus 30. I hit Tab, and then the highlights typically, not always, but typically, and in this image I think that's what we're going to do, they're gonna go down. We're going to go minus. I'm going to go minus 40, all right? And let's actually go crazy for a minute. Let's go minus 80. And you can see what that does. For example, here on this sign behind the lady there, if I go Control Z, right, that was highlight 0, highlights minus 80. You can see that a lot of the detail comes back from those highlight areas. Same thing up here on the, whatever this is, this metal thing, and up here in the window. But it might look a little unnatural if you go too much. So I'm just going to go minus 40. Let's go minus 60, just a little bit more. So you see I went back and forth, and minus 60 is what I typed there. Then for the shadows, it's going to go the other way. I'm going to bring them out. I want more detail from the shadows. So basically by going minus on the highlights and then plus on the shadows, I'm going to go, let's say 40. Let's go 60. It just brings details into the image. So if I go back to the original from here, which I'm going to do with another shortcut. This is a very good shortcut. Control-Alt-P. When you do that, all the settings disappear temporarily, and hitting Control-Alt-P again brings them back. So I can see all my changes coming in and out, or appearing and disappearing all at once. So this is the original, and this is the new version. Okay, so you can see that some detail was brought back from the shadows and highlights, and therefore, or brought up rather, not back, but brought up, so you can see these details. All right, continuing on with the whites. This is where I want to infuse a little bit more contrast, especially after bringing the detail in from, by going to a negative number on the highlights. I might go to a positive number on the whites. And now let's talk about the histogram a little bit. So up here, this image actually is pretty okay, but if there was a big gap, say up here on the right side, if it didn't quite butt up to the end, it means that I have some, I guess, dynamic range, so to speak, left over that I could use. So if I do plus 40 on the whites, as you can see, a spike forms up here, which means that I'm blowing some of the highlights there. They're overexposing, right? But that might be okay. So you can see some of the extreme highlights detail is lost, right? But overall, the image looks better. This is not the same as just leaving the highlights on 0 initially, if I had not done minus 60 here. It looks a little bit different, and you can kind of have contrast, but also detail. And the blacks, same deal. You kind of see the pattern. I'm going to go the opposite of what I went on the shadows for this. So I went, just to point that out, I went on a negative number on the highlights, so I went on a positive number on the whites, and I went on a positive number on the shadows, so I'm going to go on a negative number on the blacks. The question is just how much. So let's try minus 40. Way too much. As you can see, the image now looks quite dark, so I'm going to leave minus 20, and that's a little better. And notice all those Control Z's appearing. It's because I'm just going back and forth. And I'm just looking at it. I'm thinking, which one do I like more? I like the minus 20, so there we go. Next, we're done with at least for now. I might come back and revisit these, but for now we're done with the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks over here. Again, notice I didn't use the mouse for any of this, right? That's important. I don't like to click around on these things, just punch in numbers real quick with the keyboard. Then the clarity, this is an interesting setting. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this one. It kind of does, it's hard to kind of explain, but sort of like micro contrast, like it increases the contrast locally. So if I give it a big number like 30, which is, that's 330, let's go 30, you can see that the contrast increases sort of in the details. And some people like this look. I'm not a big fan of that. I think that looks a little digital, kind of, I guess is the word for it, like the way I would describe it. And while going minus will increase this sort of dreaminess. So if I do minus 20 here, you see like things tend to glow. If you look at the lights up here, the smoke, the image almost gets a little more smoky. But it can also look artificial, so I'm not going to do much. I'm just going to go minus 10 on this, just a little bit. Okay, then for the colors, in terms of vibrance saturation, we'll come back to that. We're going to do the white balance first. Okay, so I go back up here, a couple of tabs, and I'm on the temperature. Now to me this image is a little bit cool, so I'm going to bring it up. If it's 3200 right now, I'm just gonna guess, I'm just gonna stab at it, 3600. Okay, maybe a little too warm, right? So it was 3200 before, 3600 is too warm, so I'm just gonna go up to maybe 30 or 3400. Okay, there we go. That's a little better. See, her skin looks, the subject's skin looks a little bit more natural. The yellows in the background come through a little better. And by the way, why does a lot of people ask me who've seen me editing over my shoulder, like people, you know, watching me edit sometimes, they say, well, why does it turn blue like that? That's because if you put in, you know, 0 in here, it puts the white balance all the way down to, you know, to the coolest value, which is actually only 2000. So as I type in a number, and you see, choose a value between 2000, 50,000, whatever. If I type in a number like 3400, well, I start typing 3, 4, 0, so those are all really low, hence it's blue, and then once I put the last 0, there it is. So just in case you're wondering, why does it flash blue like that sometimes? Just ignore that. Next, the tint. So the tint is, so well, the temperature is, as you can tell from the thing, the little, you know, slider there, it's a balance between cool and warm, right? Blue and yellow. While the tint is a balance between green and magenta, right? Right now it's on -6, which makes sense. The image is quite green. So let's just 0 that, and that already looks pretty good. I think it was a very subtle change, but you know, you can tell some of the greens sort of went away. I'm gonna go a little higher. I'm gonna put it on 8. I'm gonna actually make it even more magenta. And now, if you look, these colors to me are much more natural. Okay, if I now do the Control-Alt-P shortcut, which remember that will deactivate all of my changes temporarily and show me the original. This is the original image, and this is the edit. Okay, it's almost as though I've just cleaned it up. I've clarified things. I made things a little bit more contrasty. I've removed that kind of sort of hazy, washed out looking sort of effect, and I adjusted the colors to make them look a little bit more natural. And I just did that by sight. There's no, you know, I didn't like look for a white balance point. You know, people use a gray point. I don't usually do that. I just kind of look at it. If I like it, I like it. You know, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. So yeah, next we're going to go down to vibrance. Okay, so I'm just going to tab my way down there. Again, usually I don't even have my hand on the mouse. And I'm just going to, I usually pop this one up. So I'm going to put it on 30. Okay, because I like these vivid colors. And you can see that what that does is it sort of makes the colors spread in a way. And if I can explain that in a way that makes sense, basically vibrance will not really change the things that are already very colorful. If something's already yellow, like strong yellow or red or blue, it'll stay that way. But things that are sort of like a middle yellow, like a grayish yellow, grayish blue, they're going to become more yellow, more blue, more green, whatever. So I like this because it doesn't really, you know, clip off those colors. They don't become like a flat color. You don't lose detail, but it makes the image a little more colorful. So again, if I go back, this is the standard one. It's a little more colorful, but maybe a little too colorful, and I'm a little bit worried about the maximum color, so I'm going to go down to saturation. And then this one, I usually actually go minus a little bit, like -10, just to sort of take the edge off those colors again. So I've sort of made the image overall more colorful. The maximum color is slightly reduced, okay, which again balances things out. So right here, just these changes, see I'm going back and forth, pretty much done. I wouldn't necessarily need to do much more to this. This is good to go for me. But I do a couple other things, but this is 90% of it. So when people ask me and I say I edit a photo, usually my photo editing is about 2 minutes. They don't believe me? Well, there you go. It doesn't take much, and without any explaining, I could have done this in a minute or two. Okay, but let's talk about some other tabs that I do use for extra little, you know, little kicks and little, you know, spicing up the image a little bit. Quick thing, if we go to the sharpness tab, you can see the sharpness is set to 50. The default value in here in Camera Raw is usually 25, so I've changed the default value to 50. So all my images are just on 50 sharpness. Makes them a little sharper. Then, again, I'm skipping some of these tabs, I'm not using them. Let's go straight to lens corrections. This one I typically keep on. It just sort of, I'm not going to explain what chromatic aberration is right now, but basically it cleans up some errors that happen, optically within some lenses, certain lenses. So generally this is just on. It doesn't really hurt the image. And then in this image, I'm going to just see, I don't always use this, but I'm going to see if I can correct any barrel distortion or if it's even necessary. This image doesn't have a lot of distortion, but I always like to see it. So I'm going to enable that. And a lot of things change. We'll get to that. I'm going to choose the exact profile of my lens. Sometimes it automatically detects it, but this one it doesn't. This is my Voigtlander 40mm that I like to use, especially back in these days. And I'm going to turn out the vignetting correction. I don't want that. So that just would go to 0. Okay, I did it with the mouse there, usually with the keyboard. And then I'm just going to, again, use Control Alt and P and go back and forth and see, like, do I need this distortion correction? Does it look better with it? I don't know. It doesn't make a huge difference in this image. So let's just leave it on, just for the sake of educational purposes. But you can see it doesn't really make a huge difference. If I didn't employ this correction, it wouldn't have mattered. All right. So that's one that I do use. Sometimes it's more necessary. Probably get more into it in future videos. And then the last tab we're going to take a look at is the 8th one, called camera calibration. And all I really do here, I used to, a long time ago when I used to mess around with all these things, and occasionally I still do, but basically the shadows thing. So usually what I do here is I pop this up towards the magenta. So let's just put it on 20 and see what happens. 20. Ooh, you see it kind of, only the shadows now are changing their tint. Earlier when we were doing tint with green and magenta, it was the whole image, but now it's just the shadows. So as you can see, it kind of deepens the shadows. Usually it's a little bit too much, I think 20 is too much, but I'm going to do 10. And it just kind of gives it that little bit of extra color contrast. I like contrast in the colors in my images. And that's about it. That sums it up. So you see, first pane or first tab, whatever, I pretty much change every setting in there. We didn't talk about exposure. I only really change exposure when I'm working on images with extreme kind of dynamic range in them, a lot of contrast or whatever. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I didn't talk about exposure, future video, but everything else we covered. And then lens corrections, pretty useful. And then that's it, just that last little bit on camera calibration where I like to bump up my my tint there into the magenta a little bit. It depends on the camera, by the way. This is on a Nikon D3, this image. I tend to, when I work with this camera and the Nikon D4 as well, I'm usually changing the tint like that. On a different camera, like a Ricoh GR, maybe not as often, but case by case. So that's about it. Now we can open the image. It's going to open up into Photoshop. All right, and there it is. And then I would just save this image as is. And let's open up a before image. Okay, just so you can compare. Open. Here's the before. So this was before editing, and this is after our edits. Okay, not a dramatic change, right? It's mostly subtle things, but altogether everything makes a nice big difference. The image looks great. All right, so thank you very much for watching. You know the YouTube drill: subscribe, like, do all that stuff, comment. And if you have an image of mine that you found and you really want to know how I edited that image, stick it in the comments, let me know, and I'll make a video about that specific photo for you. All right, thanks, and good luck with your shooting and your editing.